Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Ben Cubitt, who is Senior Vice President, Consulting and Engineering at Transplace. And today we're going to talk about electronic login devices, separating hype from reality. Now, ELDs has been a hot topic of conversation for over a year now. A lot of questions both from the carrier community as well as the shipper community in terms of what ELDs are going to do to the market in terms of capacity, in terms of utilization, and obviously from a shipper standpoint, ultimately, is that going to have an impact on rates or not? And Ben's been on the program before, so it's always great to have him back. And he's always in the front lines, but with both shippers and carriers, with what's happening there at Transplace. And actually, they just completed a survey not too long ago with over 2,000 carriers, where they got some insights in terms of what's happening with ELDs in the marketplace. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, to kind of, really see what's happening out there and, understand, what the impact has been to date and maybe project forward in terms of what might happen, moving forward. So with that, Ben, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Adrian. Great to be back with you.
Ben, I think a lot of folks in the industry are aware about, electronic login devices, ELDs, but just in case, anyone listening in today may not be as familiar with ELDs, but why don't we start there? Why don't you provide just a brief synopsis of what, ELDs are and, why have they received so much attention over the past year?
Great. So electronic logging devices basically are a mandate by the federal government to replace paper logs. And so any driver who's required to report hours of service has to begin using an ELD. Goes into effect for those on paper logs December of this year. For those that already have the automated onboard equipment, it gets phased in over the next couple of years. But everybody who's on paper logs has to go in December 17th. Electronic logs, there's a number of different ways to deploy the technology. The critical component has to be synchronized with the engine. So it records when the engine's on, when it's moving, a lot of other things also. But that's basically what electronic logging device is. Synchronizes with the engine, required for all drivers who have to report hours of service, and the mandate goes into effect December of this year.
So it goes in effect December of this year or December of 2017?
December of 2017. Sorry about that, Adrian. Yes, December of 2017. December of 2016 would really be quick.
Right. I just wanted to clarify that. So we're about a year away, from it coming into play, and I guess that's why it's getting a lot of attention, right? Because the clock is basically ticking and winding down. Because in the general scheme of things, a year is not that long.
Yeah, it really is not. And I think shippers are starting to pay more attention to it. As we do truckload bids for shippers, we're including that as an RFI, a series of questions. Shippers really want to know, have you implemented ELDs? If not, what are your plans to implement? I think as we'll get closer, March, June of this year, shippers will really want to know that all their carriers are compliant or will be compliant by the time it kicks in December of 2017.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've certainly, over the past year, all the conferences that I've been to, ELDs was, a topic of conversation. It's something that on Talking Logistics, I've written about a lot as well. And, I think it's something that continues to be on the radar for both shippers and carriers. So let's talk a little bit about the survey that you did. I mean, you surveyed, I think it was over 2,000, carriers of various sizes, both large carriers and small carriers. To kind of get some insight in terms of the adoption rate and what the impact has been to date. So let's start with adoption. Are carriers well on their way to kind of meeting the mandate, which is, about a year away, or are they, procrastinating? And did you see any differences between large and small carriers?
Yeah, and that's why we wanted to do this survey too, Adrian. There's a lot, as you said, there's been a lot written about ELDs, a lot of talk about ELDs. There's a lot of, kind of myths about ELDs, both what the impact is going to be and what it takes to implement them. So at Transplace, we really like to be data driven. If we're going to tell our shippers, our customers, people in the industry something, ideally we want to offer not just our opinion, but we want it to be a fact-based opinion as much as we can. So that's why we designed the survey. We wanted to understand what was the adoption rate, because there's a lot of anecdotal information out there. So we sent the survey, we designed the survey, we worked with carriers, worked with some of our shippers to decide what questions we should ask, and then we sent it out to 2,000 carriers, big, medium, and small, and we got back a good percentage, a very valid response, and it was also spread. We got responses from carriers with less than 25 trucks, 25 to 50, 50 to 200, 200 to 500, and greater than 1,000. So we had a large number of carriers respond, and we got the responses back across the board. It wasn't just all small carriers or all large carriers, which was important to us. We really wanted to understand, and as we got the survey results, it was even more important because we saw a real disparity between adoption rates in larger carriers, greater than 200 trucks, 250 trucks, and smaller carriers. And we can talk a little bit more about that.
So what, I think most people who, if I were to do such a survey, I would probably assume that the larger carriers were probably, those that, the name brand carriers that have a lot of trucks, that tend to be perhaps a little bit further ahead of the curve when it comes to technology and things like that, they would probably be ahead of the curve in terms of implementing, ELDs, and perhaps owner operators, driver in his truck, or, smaller firms would probably be further back. In terms of implementation. Is that the way it kind of split out in terms of the results?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that consistently. We saw it with our initial survey. We followed up and asked additional carriers. We saw exactly the same trends. And then as we've recently been doing these shipper-specific bid RFIs, we've seen the same results. And so what we've seen in the survey is that large carriers, greater than 250 trucks, are virtually fully implemented or well along the way. 81% of the large carriers that we surveyed are fully implemented today. They've got ELDs. A lot of them have been running them for multiple years. They've worked out the kinks. They've learned how to plan better. We can talk about that, the impacts on productivity. And the other 18%, 19% are in various stages of implementing. So the larger carriers, it's just a non-issue. The smaller carriers, we saw kind of exactly the opposite. About 33% said they were fully implemented, and 63% were planning on implementing, but it kind of went into those kind of thirds. So 33% are fully implemented, additional 33% are planning, and there's 25 or 30% out there who were kind of, especially at the time of the original survey, taking a wait and see attitude. Because when we originally did the survey in May, there were a number of lawsuits challenging the ELD mandate. And on October 31st, kind of Halloween, one of those was decided by a federal court and was denied, and said no, ELDs can go forward and be fully implemented. So there's a little bit less of ambiguity about whether the next thing that the people who brought the lawsuits would do is have to appeal it to the Supreme Court, and that's a high hurdle, and they haven't announced their strategy yet. But really, the denial at the lower court level, I think, really was definitive for a lot of folks, and said, hey, we need to go do this now.
Yeah, so you just, I was going to ask, and I think you kind of perhaps partially answered it, already. I was going to ask if there was any insights as to why, some of the smaller carriers, have been procrastinating or haven't been as further along the implementation path as some of the larger ones. So it sounds like, obviously, with some of the litigation that you talked about, that created some wait and see type of feeling out in the carrier market. Any other insights as to why they're behind the curve? I mean, has cost been an issue? Has that been something that carriers have also expressed, or is cost not really an issue?
I think you can break it into a couple of factors. Cost is a little bit of an issue. I don't want to minimize the cost, but we're talking hundreds of dollars, not thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. So to implement ELDs, there's a lot of options. There's very inexpensive, moderately expensive, and and expensive. But even on the expensive end, you're talking about approaching $1,000 a truck. And the time to train a driver on ELDs is not significant. So it's not like a driver has to go away for a week's training or anything like that. So cost is a component, but when you look at the overall cost of operating a fleet or operating a truck, it's not going to be a major line item. So while cost was a factor, I think a bigger factor was, I think part of it's emotional. Independent owner operators is exactly what it says. Some of the people who drive trucks are entrepreneurs, they're independent, and there's a feeling of, I'm going to be controlled, someone's watching me, they'll know where I am, some of the things that you hear talked about in the industry. And so there was just general resistance. And again, some people didn't want to do it because, maybe they've got 5 trucks. They may have some other reasons to think about, do I want to keep doing this? Do I not want to do it? And that's another hurdle. And we can talk more later, because I think those are some of the big questions as shippers looked, and it's, all this anecdotal, ELDs are going to be the end of the world and they're going to be this major constraint on capacity, which we don't believe is the case. And we can talk about why. But I think, the big questions were, who's implemented? Will there be time to implement? How big's the hurdle to implement? What's the status of these court cases? And one after the other. And I think the survey really documented that it's, the big guys are already, the big fleets are implemented or shortly will be. A lot of the small to mediums are, and there's really not a significant hurdle from a cost or time. People have plenty of time and the cost is not prohibitive to implement. So I think the third question, which we can talk about from the survey results, is, will drivers leave the industry? Will carriers leave the industry?
Right. I want to get to that question for sure. So it sounds like, we've got, over a year, to go here. It sounds that, from what you just said, that really is plenty of time for some of these carriers, that particular smaller ones that, haven't implemented yet, to, put it in place, do the training with the drivers and everything else. Because it sounds like, both the cost hurdle and the implementation hurdle is not that big.
Yeah, and we talked to fleets, medium to large fleets. So I talked to some fleets who have a significant amount of trucks, let's say in the hundreds, who have the ELDs ready to go. They've bought the technology, they've got it on part of their trucks, and they're just waiting to turn it on. And they're going to do a phased implementation, and they really don't want to turn it on until they have to. So you may see some of these folks have the technology, know how to do it, and do a slow roll. And then in the last 90 days, 180 days, they can bring the final driver's own. I think there's some fear among them they may lose drivers, or they just don't want to irritate the driver base till they have to, if you will. Could there be if you're waiting to the last 60 days, could there be challenges? I think there could be, access to technology, implementation. I mean, we've all done system implementations, even though this is not anything like an ERP or other systems like that, it's still an implementation. So, I think folks that wait to the last 60, 90 days, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. But again, you could even be onboarding drivers that quickly.
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely. I mean, I think the last thing you want to do is kind of do this big bang rushed, rollout, with, just a few weeks to go, because it is, it goes beyond the technology, and the training of the drivers. There's a lot of, process issues. And, as we all know, with any kind of implementation, not everything runs smoothly on day one. So there's unexpected kinks that come up, and, you want to give yourself time to, address those. So let's talk now about, kind of the other question I think, folks have is, based on the survey, I mean, have carriers experienced, those that have implemented already, or those that plan to, do they expect to experience any impact to capacity or utilization? Did they report any link between using ELDs and, hours of service and logging violations, anything around those, those topics?
Yeah, I think there's 3 or 4 areas to talk about there. So let's take the potential negatives first, because there's been a lot of concern about those. That's when people think of ELDs, that's kind of top of mind. Is it going to impact capacity? So I think it could impact capacity in 2 ways. One is availability of drivers, the question of, will drivers leave the industry? And then the second question is, now that I've gone from a paper log to an electronic log, and we've certainly seen this as we schedule trucks, as we monitor and look at truck pickups and deliveries, different than paper logs. If a carrier's 10 miles from the final delivery and that driver runs out of hours, they will park the truck, and so, but with planning, you overcome that. So let's take the first question, the big question. Will drivers leave the industry? So if you look at the survey, and we asked carriers, did you lose any drivers? 51% said yes, 48, 49% said no. And so that's concerning. So when you just see that number, you think, okay, that's concerning. But we allowed free-form text in the survey, and we got lots of great comments. Some really insightful, some amusing, some interesting. But when you really looked at the data points, overwhelmingly we saw people say, hey, I have 350 trucks, I lost 2 drivers. Someone else said, I lost 5 drivers out of 120. We only had one data point that said, hey, I've got 110 trucks, I lost 29 drivers. Now, as we all know, there's significant driver turnover all of the time. So how much of that was regular turnover that was attributed to ELDs? We don't know, right? It's not an audited result. But again, multiple data points that say, hey, we had no trouble implementing this, some driver resistance. Now the drivers would fight you if you wanted to go back to paper logs. So I look at the survey results as one data point, but then the second data point that says, will you lose drivers? Again, 81% of the large fleets are fully implemented, and the rest are implementing. And ELDs has not been identified by anyone as a significant hindrance to keeping drivers. There's all the challenges of finding, recruiting, and keeping drivers, but ELDs, all those big fleets are, right in line with everyone else as far as driver turnover. They're where they were historically. If driver turnover has been getting a little bit worse, then they're tracking that. But all those large carriers that have implemented ELDs, medium carriers, they have drivers in the trucks, and no one's reported, hey, I can't put drivers in 40% of the trucks in my fleet, because of ELDs. So, the survey results plus what we see with the experience of large carriers says that, that there hasn't been this mass exodus and that drivers in large percentages are leaving because of ELDs. Now, we're not fully implemented. They have other options. But I look at that same thing. If a lot of drivers really were not going to do ELDs, then you would expect more transition from the fleets implementing them to the carriers that don't have ELDs. Because right now you have options. By December of 2017, you won't have options. So we think the data from the survey, what we see in the field, what we hear from our carrier partners says that, the data says that large numbers of drivers are not leaving the industry because of ELDs, or even leaving carriers that have implemented ELDs.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think I think your survey kind of shows how you really have to dig beneath the numbers sometimes, because, like you said, if you just asked that question, you saw 50, more than 50% said yes. Scary. Right, you would say, oh my gosh, the world is ending. But when you look at it from a percentage basis, if they're losing, 1 or 2 drivers out of 100, you're talking about 1%, 2%, and then, like you said, is that just normal turnover, because there is a lot of turnover in trucking to begin with, or is ELD a contributing factor there? So it seems like, based on the fact that many of the large carriers have already been using ELDs for quite some time, so it's kind of like baked into their results already over the past, a year plus, and based on the fact that, with the additional kind of data that you got and comments, that it doesn't seem that's going to be that big of an issue.
The second part to address is, what happens to driver efficiency, fleet utilization, average miles, and we asked that also. And the majority of carriers said, hey, we expect a negative impact from ELDs. And, it varied from, at the high end, some carriers saying, hey, we expect, 20, 30% impact on productivity. Most were in the 10, 12, 5 to 10%. And what we've kind of consistently heard from carriers who have implemented ELDs is that initially you see a significant hit to productivity, 6, 8%, but with better planning, you can improve that. Fleets that start running ELDs start learning I don't want to dispatch this driver to this type of load if they only have this many hours left. So you really start matching, you got all this ELD data tells you how many hours that a driver has. The driver has that, the driver manager has that, what loads you're going to accept. And so what we've seen and heard from carriers is that once you implement with better planning, you can really reduce that impact. I think that there is an impact there. We've heard enough. We've seen it. We've seen real world, but I don't think it's cataclysmic. It is an impact. If I were operating I don't want to minimize it. If I were operating a business and I took a 4 to 6 or 3 to 8%, somewhere in that range impact on productivity, I'd be concerned, right? But it's not 50%, 80%. It's not 20%. And so that's what we've consistently heard. On the positive side, what the survey talked about is, it's what you hear in the press as people talk about ELDs. One is that, it does relieve the driver of the admin burden of manually keeping up with hours of service. Now it's automated, so that frees up some driver time. Second thing we heard was that you see a real reduction in hours of service violations. And so, in a way, that's a productivity hit or improvement. So there's some offsets, and there are some benefits. The other things, most ELDs are part of a larger kind of fleet management system. So you get all sorts of important information, hard braking, fuel efficiency. So as ELDs and these larger systems that ELDs are often a component of, carriers get a lot of information that drives efficiency. So this is overall a net, it's part, the ELD doesn't. ELD contributes some productivity because of the paperwork and some other areas, but the fleet management system that ELDs are often a part of provides a lot of information back to the carrier that can increase. There's a lot of analysis that says it increases safety. Carriers and drivers that are on ELDs report fewer accidents than those on paper logs. It helps with more efficient driving, better fuel mileage, et cetera. So there's a lot of side benefits, not just of ELDs, but of the systems that ELDs are often a part of.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you were talking about, in terms of minimizing the impact to productivity, you basically need through better planning, right? And I think that suggests to me that, we always talk about shippers, when you talk about shippers and using spreadsheets and fax machines instead of a TMS to manage their operations, they're basically leaving money on the table, not being as efficient as they can be. I would imagine that for carriers, particularly those that might be more on the mid-size, if they're not using, the equivalent of a TMS for their operations, a carrier-based system that helps with that kind of planning, that they might be more challenged than those that already have some technology in place that will help them with more, effective planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I do believe it becomes much more of an optimization exercise, and so the more you can look at a bunch of data and with technology or without technology, do a better job planning, you really can. And I think shippers are going to have to do a better job. And we've done in a parallel effort because of ELDs and just because of carrier efficiency. We have customers and we have carriers, and we think both of those are equally important to Transplace and to our shipper customers. And so we've done some additional surveys about what it means to be a preferred shipper. And so as you look at these ELDs, we were talking to some carriers last week and some shippers at a meeting, and we talked about tweener routes. So now you have these 600 to 800 mile routes that really can be difficult depending on the time of day that you tender the load and when you want it delivered. In an ELD world, those can be difficult to deliver under the way they used to kind of get delivered in a paper log. And so, and there's some other things you look at. 24/7 becomes much more important. So if I'm a carrier, I've got these ELDs, I'm really going to be controlled in the hours of service. I need to maximize the efficiency of my driver. And so if you're a shipper that only allows pickups or deliveries between a tight window, that becomes a challenge. So shippers that are 24/7, if you give a carrier a longer haul load on Thursday or Friday that'll keep them driving all the way to next Monday when they can pick up a load, give them a very long haul load, that becomes a lot more advantageous. So I think as shippers deal with these productivity hits and the challenges of ELDs, I think there's going to be a lot more discussions between shippers and carriers and 3PLs about how do we bring more efficiency to the network, because nobody wants that hit, and shippers don't want their carrier partners to take that hit. And if we are in a driver shortage overall, and if that is the scarce resource we all believe it is, we want to keep those folks in the industry. We want to keep them moving. That's how they get paid. And I think as we come into this ELD world, I think that's going to put even more impetus and push behind shippers and carriers kind of collaboratively doing a better job of planning and leveraging those resources.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but absolutely. I think, the way I see it, this, same as you, I think this could be a catalyst for better, collaboration between shippers and carriers to really look at the end-to-end process in terms of everything from when do we tender to delivery windows, lead times, so on and so forth. And I think really looking for the, best possible, scenario that's a win-win, for both parties to, maximize the, utilization and productivity while still meeting the requirements from the shipper end of things.
Yeah, I think, just to add one more, we think about anything that, keeps that driver from moving or causes kind of unproductive movement for the driver. So things like detention becomes a much bigger deal. Are you unloading me in an hour, 2 hours? Are you holding up the truck for 3 or 4 hours? Are you, what's the impact of stops? And then things like parking. We really have this challenge of parking. So if I come to pick up a load and I'm a little early and you don't have parking on your facility and you tell me to go down to a crowded truck stop and I'm using hours, all those become issues and I think, some of these systems will also give carriers data where they can go into a shipper and talk more. So I think we're going to see more data-driven discussions. Shippers and 3PLs have really existed to kind of do scorecards on the carriers and tell the carriers any inefficiency they're causing them. And I think that's going to be a little bit more of a two-way conversation and it needs to be a data-driven conversation. So maybe this will push some of that along.
Yeah, no, great. So you're talking about shippers, and you mentioned this early on, where just kind of curious in terms of whether ELDs are being incorporated as part of the transportation procurement process. Are shippers and 3PLs asking carriers whether they're ELD compliant as part of that RFP process? And if so, is the data you're getting back out of the procurement engagements, how do they match up with kind of what you're seeing here with the survey, that you did, and how important is ELD compliance becoming for shippers as part of the selection process?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, Transplace, our engineering team, probably does 150 procurement events a year working with shippers, air, ocean, parcel, LTL. But truckload is the predominant, truckload intermodal. And so what we've seen, and we've encouraged, and our shippers have asked us in the most recent bids, we've started including that as part of the RFI. We use SciQuest as our bid technology, and it has strong RFI capability. So as we've been doing recent bids, we've been asking carriers as part of that, kind of the same RFI, the same ELD questions. Have you implemented ELDs? If not, what's your plan? What percentage are you implemented? Kind of the basic questions. And so in the last 90 days, we've had a couple bids complete, and I can share the data with you. And we did the same thing. We as the RFI, we also asked how many tractors carrier has, et cetera. And so just to give you two examples, just completed bids. The first shipper is a paper and packaging company, and they had 134 carriers in the bid that responded to the survey. Of those, 103 had more than 200 trucks. So the majority of their carriers are larger carriers, and the statistics on that were 93 had already implemented ELDs, 5 were going to implement them within the next 90 days, 2 within the next 180 days, and only 3 were outside that 180-day period. So again, 95% in this bid for a specific shipper of their carriers over 200 trucks have already implemented ELDs. Then when you look at the less than 200 trucks, you kind of see the same split. 10 of those 31 carriers have already implemented. 10 are planning on doing it in the next 180 days, and 10 are greater than 180 days. And so to give you another example, another shipper, a CPG, a large CPG, both of these had freight spends in excess of 150 million a year. So good sized shippers. The second one, again, similar carrier base, 145 carriers in their bid, 107 greater than 200 trucks in their fleet. Very similar numbers. 96 have already implemented, 2 within the next 90 days, 5 within 91 to 180 days. Only 4 were greater than 180 days to be implemented. So, 98% are either fully implemented or will be in a very short time zone. But then when you look at the less than 200 trucks, and this was 38 of this shipper's 145 carriers in the bid, 24 were already implemented, 6 were planning, and 8 were still waiting. So very similar results. And again, I think, my favorite email of the last couple of weeks, Adrian, is there was an analyst sent an email, and I got it forwarded to me by a number of people, but it said, ELDs are coming, the world's going to end, capacity is going to disappear, rates are going to go up 25%. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. And so, against that kind of anecdotal ELDs are going to end the world, look at these 2 shippers. They've got committed carrier bases that are 90% implemented. So they would easily be able to shift their volume. And I think you'll see that, by June. I spent 2/3 of my career on the shipper side, and I would want to be able to go to my boss and say, hey, I know you're hearing a little bit about ELDs, or if you haven't, here's what's going on. Our carriers are fully implemented, or our carriers are, all but 2 of our carriers are implemented. Those 2 expect to be fully implemented at least 60 days before the mandate. If they're not, we can move that volume, and we're not concerned about it. We're watching it. So that's what shippers do. Shippers are data driven. They look at plans. A lot of people managing transportation are engineers, and they're going to look to make sure that their company is protected, and that they're for their stakeholders and their internal customers that they have capacity. It's not going to be impacted by ELDs. So, Mike, I don't want to totally minimize this. Brokerage. We haven't talked about brokerage yet. Brokerage. When we do the survey with brokers, even large brokers, the response we get back from many of them is, I'm a broker, I don't have drivers. So it's not a relevant question to me. But we know that brokers are starting to do the same due diligence, making sure that their underlying carriers are covered by ELDs, and they're going to want to be able to tell shippers, certainly Transplace, we want to be able to communicate to our shippers that we have a solid plan, and that we're making sure our underlying carriers are ELD compliant. So again, I think the bids, 2 important things about the bids. One, shippers have this data now, so coming out of the bids, and there's a huge amount of bids going on right now. A lot of shippers are annual bids, but I think you're going to see shippers focus on that and really push their carriers to be compliant. And if I were a shipper, anything after June of this year would be a red flag to me if I had carriers that weren't fully implemented.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of shippers, are kind of looking at this, or will look at this from a risk management, standpoint, right? So, being able to start capturing that information, that data, and at the end of the day, they don't want to be in a situation where a significant percentage of their carriers or important lanes are impacted by carriers that are not ELD compliant, and they can run into some issues there. So at a minimum, they're gonna be asking the questions more over the next few months than perhaps they have in the past, and get for themselves a pulse on what's happening in the market. Ben, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to go right to my last question here. Kind of as a way to summarize and wrap up. I mean, what does the data, at the end of the day, if you had to sum it all up, what does the data and the feedback that you've gotten from carriers, tell us today about the adoption and impact of ELDs, and what questions remain unanswered? What are some of the things that we'll you're going to have to wait and see, or have to see what happens in the months ahead?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it. So to the first part of your question, what does the data tell us? I think the data tells us what and I think it was great to get the data because we anecdotally or, talking to carriers, you had a feeling, but I think what it tells you is one, a much higher percentage than the kind of industry. Some of the feedback would let you believe are already implemented. So that's the first big question. What percentage of carriers have already implemented? And it's a high percentage. What percentage are planning to implement? Again, a very high percentage. Will people lose drivers? I think that's the big question. And I would put that as there's no evidence to say that it's going to be a huge impact on the industry. But we'll come back to that second part of your question. And then finally, we wanted to see what the cost and time to implement was. And while I don't want to minimize that, if I were a carrier and I had to spend $500 or $1,000 per truck, and I might lose some productivity per driver in what's already a challenged industry with rate depression that's going on and increasing cost of tractors and trailers and all that. I want to minimize it, but it's not tens of thousands of dollars, per truck. It's not going to drive you out of business. And so I think the remaining question is how many drivers will leave? Even though the evidence says, if 2% of drivers leave, if 1% of drivers leave, that's significant. So while I believe truck drivers are drivers for a reason. They like that lifestyle, and the evidence says that even drivers who are resistant, once ELDs came in, they'd fight you to go back to paper logs. So, I believe that, I'm not sure ELDs are going to tip people over. Then the second question you get asked a lot are some of the smaller carriers, marginal carriers, going to go out of business. We don't know that again, but again, if I was already thinking about leaving the industry, this might be enough to push me over. But on the counter side of that, if I'm operating 10 trucks or 50 trucks and the business makes sense to me and it's a viable business, ELDs are not going to really push me over the edge from a cost or any other. So, but those are the questions, and then I think the last question is, what's the impact on brokers? So, if some brokers are really heavily reliant on owner-operators, smaller fleets, and some of these drivers or fleets do leave the industry, what's that impact? But again, if you look at the two shippers that we were looking at, for their asset-based carriers, they don't have a major concern. They're 90% implemented, 5% will implement in the next very short term, and 5% more, or a little bit longer term. But if I were 95% compliant right now in my carrier base, it doesn't feel like a crisis to me.
Yeah, a great way to summarize, where we are today and what some of the remaining questions are. Well, Ben, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always manage to just scratch the surface on this topic, but I think we provided some great insights, thanks to the data you collected in terms of kind of separating the hype from reality, and what's happening with ELDs, and especially as we're kind of heading into, 2017 here. Certainly, the one thing that we know for sure with transportation management is that, things are going to look different, tomorrow than they do today, than they did, yesterday. It's an ever-changing market. So thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Adrian. It is an important topic. I enjoyed discussing it.
Great. I'm sure that you always do a lot of surveys throughout the year. I'm sure this is something with as you continue to do RFIs and things like that, you'll continue to gather some more data and insight into what's happening. So maybe we'll bring you on and get an update, sometime late spring or early summer to see whether those 5% are if there's been a fire lit behind them and they're actually implementing, or if they're still procrastinating. So
Thank you.
I want to thank those of you that joined us today. We didn't get any questions, but if you are watching this on demand, either at the Transplace website or the Talking Logistics website, and you've got a question for Ben, you can post a question there. I'm sure that he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.